I'm Charles Traub. I'm the chair of photography, video, and related media, MFA Photography. And this is our facility, and this is a program that we're very happy to support and engage with, and invite you all back anytime. If you look at our website, we have all kinds of events, mostly on a Tuesday night, that are public. And we had a big one this weekend with the American Photographic Archives Association. This room was packed all the way back. We keep doing it, and so please look at our website if you want to be on our mailing list. Leave a note for me, and I'll put you on. I just want to kind of remind everybody, I was hoping there'd be more students tonight, but they have their orals coming up at the end of the week, so that's a problem. I don't think any of us, or many of us, would be here quite in the way we are right now without Minor White and Aperture and the history that I think will unfold tonight. And I'm going to introduce Sarah in a minute. Let me say, I first encountered Aperture in 1968, fresh out of the Peace Corps. I met Ralph Eugene Meatyard and Paul Caponegro at a workshop in Louisville, Kentucky. And Paul was, of course, a great follower of Miners. And he recently died, and we're a big loss to our community. And Gene Meatyard was always associated through letters and other issues with Miners. A person in that workshop gave me a full set of apertures that were up to date to that period, 1968, in perfect mint condition. And I remember looking at them and thinking how beautifully produced. They were thin, but gorgeous reproductions of a kind that no other photographic vehicle had at that time. And that really engaged me, and I started to read them, and I got into something about photography that I, and my generation, I think, had not experienced, which is the idea of personal creative search through the medium of the world in which we wanted to expose ourselves to. Very different than the Slick magazines or Life magazines or Photo, what was it, US Photo, and so on and so forth. They were mostly journalistic. That sparked in me my whole career, and in fact, I think the career of perhaps a lot of you here, and certainly it was one of the pillars of the education of the photographer. It had moved from that smaller community. There were places like the Institute of Design and the New School and other places teaching for her. But from that period, the photo world as we know it, let's call it the serious fine art world, though I don't like that term, expanded, got out of the basement, into the first floor, and finally both in the gallery and in the schools throughout America and all over the world for that matter. Aperture was the pillar of all of that. It was something we look forward to the magazine monthly and to all the publications. And our library has that collection, by the way, of early apertures, if anybody wants access to them. And I think they're kind of rare right now, such a full collection. I want to welcome all the staff and everybody from Aperture and all our speakers. Sarah's going to introduce them. Sarah Meister, as most of you know, is the director of Aperture, and she has a long history that goes back to Miner's roots, or rather his connection with Princeton University, where she first encountered his archives through Peter Brunel and Emmett Gowan when she was a student. That archive and that resource is tremendous. And she later went, after graduation, to MoMA, where she spent about 25 years curating, organizing, engaging the photographic public, and part of the educational pillars that we all revere. And I thank you for coming here and welcome you back. Lastly, I just want you to acknowledge Marvin Heiferman and Carol Kismerick, who were our partners and kind of spurred their publications out of Aperture. Carol was a major editor at Aperture for, must have been 20 years at least. They were both, and Marvin still is, a pillar of this institution and our program. Welcome everybody. Sarah.
Thank you so much, Charles. It's really a pleasure to be here. I was going to introduce myself, but now I don't need to. And I was also going to introduce Aperture, but I also don't need to do that. So thank you so much. I do want to say it's a pleasure to be here tonight. Thank you to SVA. Thank you to the Princeton University Art Museum, to the Princeton University Press for publishing this. But before providing this introduction, I do want to acknowledge Kate Bessard, who unfortunately can't be with us tonight, but she really is the guiding light and the generating force behind this. And so I know she's really sorry not to be here. And I would like to introduce Caroline Harris to say a few words, and I'll jump back in for some introductions.
Good evening. I'm Caroline Harris, Senior Associate Director for Education at the Princeton University Art Museum. And it's a delight to have you all here to celebrate the publication of Minor White's memorable Fancies, one of the most significant previously unpublished texts in the history of photography, and an essential part of the life's work of the artist, editor, and educator, Minor White. Although White introduced sections of Memorable Fancies to the public during his lifetime, the full manuscript has never been accessible outside of the physical archive at Princeton to more than a handful of people. And we are so proud to bring it at last to a wide readership. To set the table for tonight's panel, Minor White was one of the most important photographic artists active after World War II. He helped shape a singularly modern vision that challenged the definition of photography as a documentary medium, as we've just heard. His connection to Princeton came about through Peter Bunnell. Bunnell first met White as an undergraduate at the Rochester Institute of Technology. It was the start of a decades-long friendship that continued when Bunnell arrived at Princeton University in 1972. At Bunnell's invitation, White made several visits to Princeton's campus where he lectured and conducted seminars. Pleased by how seriously photography was being engaged at Princeton, White arranged to bequest his archive to the museum before his death in 1976. The Minor White Archive is a rich repository numbering over 17,000 prints, over 17,000 black and white negatives, the original manuscripts for Memorable Fancies, what we're all here tonight to celebrate, as well as correspondence, teaching papers, and more. The Minor White Project Committee ensures White's legacy and promotes the use of the archive for new opportunities to consider White's myriad contributions to photography, including, and the committee also awards 8 grants to facilitate research in the archive. Now, I would be remiss if I did not take a moment to mention the museum's managing editor, Anna Brower, who worked tirelessly on this volume. She couldn't be with us tonight, but our editor, Charles Gut, is. And of course, we are so grateful to Todd Cronan for his years-long dedication, without which we would not have this publication. So thank you all for joining us tonight.
So you heard that Minor White is one of Aperture's founders, along with Dorothea Lange, Ansel Adam, Beaumont Newhall, Nancy Newhall, and others. And in their words, Aperture was originated to, quote, communicate with serious photographers and creative people everywhere. and this remains at the heart of what we are doing at Aperture today. We are really thrilled to hear from this incredible group of artists and thinkers this evening, thinking about the way in which minor white impacted photography and its history. We wanted to cast a wide net, so expanding the canon by asking artists who may not have had a direct connection with minor white, but whose practice points to the vastness of his impact. So to quickly introduce our moderator and panelists, Todd Cronan is professor of art history at Emory University and the editor-in-chief of nonsite.org. He's the author of multiple books, most recently, Nothing Permanent, Modern Architecture in California, and he served as the co-editor, obviously, of the book we are discussing tonight. Aspen Mays is a photographer and installation artist. She is associate professor and chair of undergraduate photography, print media, and painting and drawing, all, at California College of Arts. Her book, 10-Gallon Sunflower, was published in 2024 by Deus Books and is in the photo book review at the back of the last issue of Aperture magazine. Don't miss it. Lyle Ashton Harris is an Aperture trustee, I'm proud to say, and he has cultivated a diverse artistic practice ranging from photography and collage to video installation and performance art, examining the impact of race, gender, and desire on the contemporary social and cultural dynamic globally through intersections of the personal and the political. Harris is a professor of art and art education at New York University. Mark McKnight, who first entered my radar when he was the 2019 Portfolio Prize winner at Aperture, he's a photographer who uses his practice to reconcile his own identity as a mixed-race person of color and a gay man. He was a 2023-2024 Guggenheim Fellow, and he is assistant professor of expanded photography at Rutgers University. Our speakers, as you heard, will be able to answer a few questions at the end of the panel. Wait for the microphone. And thank you once again to Princeton University Art Museum, Princeton University Press, and SVA for hosting us tonight. Todd, hand it over to you.
Thank you. Do you have the remote?
I don't have the remote, but I believe you have the remote.
Can you turn the lights down a little bit? Is that possible?
Yes, I
No
think we
problem.
will turn down the lights.
Yeah.
Yep, turn on the lights, remote,
Thank you.
no problem.
All right. So a warm thank you. I'm very sad that Kate Bissard is not here tonight. She is really the steward of this whole project and has been an enthusiast for getting this done for many, many years. So warm thank you to Kate, to Sarah Meister, to Alex Schlechter, to the Princeton Art Museum, and to Aperture for inviting me here today, and to Lyle, Mark, and Aspen for taking part in this conversation. I just have a few brief remarks here. So my way into minor white's work comes down really when I think about it to Jim Welling, who's here today, and to Peter Bunnell. So I vividly remember Jim saying to me, he probably doesn't remember this, more than 10 years ago, more minor. And his infectious enthusiasm really stuck with me ever since. Peter, who by complete coincidence was a neighbor of mine, I used to go over there and he would spin these incredible tales about his life in photography, and minor was certainly at the center of that, which to me was a very mysterious photographic universe. And I was rereading Peter's The Eye That Shapes, his amazing catalog on minor white. I was looking at it again this morning and I was struck by a great phrase that I think is useful for tonight's discussion. This is what Peter says. White's life had an integrated structure to it, a finely wrought architecture of creative energy that produced an interrelated body of work from his pictorial achievement to his work as a teacher, editor, critic, and writer. And I think that's very much the case. Memorable Fancies is a remarkable expression or creation of an integrated life. It combines poetry, excerpts from letters, diary entries, photographic field notes, travel itineraries, theoretical reflections, meditations on the self, and random thoughts from his life. All of which fall under the heading of what White called camera as a way of life. If I were to put one word to White's view of the medium, it's that a camera is a means of universal communication. communication meant for White the pursuit of what he called creation. That's, I think, the kind of core term for him, creation, which was at the opposite pole from expression, which meant self-expression. Camera as a technology was construed by him as a means to progressively detach oneself from the self. That's to say the technology itself had this kind of alienating quality to it that he found central for him. White's first great sequence, and now you see it in total, so this is, I'm showing you all of it here. This is from 1948, The Temptation of St. Anthony is Mirrors. This is the first group, whoops, sorry. And the second part of it, it's all his first major sequence that he did. White's first great sequence, A Temptation of St. Anthony is Mirrors, is comprised of 32 photographs. This is something I discuss at some length in my introduction. The title of this sequence is very important. Mirrors are tempting because the self is tempting. Mirrors of the self are always for White at the expense of understanding others. So that's why he's constantly reflecting on this move from expression, which is about self, to creation, which is outside of the self. White's creative credo appears in the epigrams that introduce photographic sequences 15 and 17, and they share a nearly identical title. This is what he says. Out of my desire, seek to return you to yourself. And, this is for 17, out of my love for you, I will give you back to yourself. White was always seeking a way to turn his desires into a gift, to turn his love and his passion into a work of creation, the hope always being that with creation, he could find his perfect expression. Now, for those unfamiliar with White, I will quickly touch on some of the major events in his life and career. I'll show you a kind of slide history of his life. He was born in 1908 in Minneapolis, and in 1927 went to the University of Minnesota, where he studied botany and began his lifelong devotion to poetry. He writes his first entries for Memorable Fancies in 1931, and in 1937 he moves to Portland, Oregon, and becomes fascinated with the work of modernist photographers like Bernice Abbott, Ansel Adams, Alfred Stieglitz, and Edward Weston. And these are two photographs from that early period in Portland. And what I think is essential about them is what I'll call relational. That is, there's always at least two things in some kind of dialogue within the picture, and that's actually kind of his main, in a certain sense, his main contribution or response to the modernist tradition. I'll say more about that in just a second. In Oregon, he works for the Works Progress Administration, the WPA, and also begins his important involvement in photographing theater performances. In 1942, he makes his first photographic sequence and reads Richard Boleslavsky's Acting the First 6 Lessons, a book that was absolutely central for his whole life, and he comes back to it to the very end. So Sue Martin here on the left is a woman who introduced him to this book, and it's something he comes back to, as I say, over and over again. In 1942, he's drafted into the Army and joins the Roman Catholic Church, I guess as one does. After the war, he goes to Columbia and studies under the art historian Meyer Shapiro. In spring of 46, he meets Alfred Stieglitz, which is a major event in his life, and in the summer, he takes up a position at the California School of Fine Arts. It's also in 1946 that he meets his hero, Edward Weston, for the first time. And I put these up here because, again, I think this points to something, what I call relational in White. What you have with Weston, of course, is always a singular, not always, primarily a singular object, whereas for White, he takes those elements very self-consciously from Weston and puts them in dialogue with something else. That is, I think, essential for his art. So yes, in 46, he meets his hero, Edward Weston, for the first time. And as I said, something that has not been noticed is the fact that from the beginning, his photographs were often a kind of critical commentary or comic commentary, if you like, on the work of his heroes. This one, I think, is a kind of comment on Stieglitz. He's much more ironic about his sources than I think people kind of credit him for. Weston and Stieglitz, his heroes, right, Weston and Stieglitz. The nature of the commentary in works like this is to emphasize, as I say, relationality, where Weston and Stieglitz focused on singular heroic objects or actions. I also want to point out a kind of persistent structural quality to his work, the relational quality. So you see photographs like this, and this is something that Peter Bunnell very much emphasized, showing how works by White from the beginning to the end really persisted with a certain kind of structural arrangement. So here you have the nude with this is a Van Gogh, so it's in relation, right? It's the nude with something else, and an artwork and a cultural artifact, which Weston or Stieglitz would have zero interest in. And then you have, again here, a photograph of Tom Murphy, one of his great early models, and a Picasso on the right. So he puts it in dialogue, often with cultural elements, historical cultural elements, which, again, is somewhat anathema to the vision of someone like Weston and Stieglitz. And as I say, the kind of structural feature, these are related in terms of how they're arranged. In 1952, he founds Aperture magazine, and the next year he takes up a position at the George Eastman House in Rochester, New York. In 1956, he joins RIT, the Rochester Institute of Technology, for a full-time position and begins writing a series of unpublished books. I'll just name a few of those: Canons of Camera Work, Conscious Photography, Creative Audience, Visualization Manual. These are all in the archives and quite amazing books to look at. In 1965, he takes up his last position at MIT and begins teaching a series of very influential workshops throughout the country. And a lot of the material in the later part of the Memorable Fancies is about these workshops. And finally, in 1974, he travels for the first time to Rome and to Peru and ceases his editorship of Aperture in 75. He dies in June of 1976 at the age of 68. I was flagging these kind of late photographs because I actually think the late works, which have not been discussed very much, are actually quite kind of amazing. So there's much more to be said about this work and kind of spots of his career that have not been discussed. So there's a great deal more to say, but at this point I want to turn it over to Lyle, Aspen, and Mark to hear their remarks on Minor. I think, Mark, are you?
Yeah, thank you. If I hit this one to go
You hit the
forward.
plate, yeah.
Great. Hi, I've also been introduced. I'm honored to be here, and I am by no means an expert on White, but I'm grateful to be here because his work has been so essential to my formation as an artist. I'll use my 5 minutes or so to qualify my being here. I think it seems useful to mention that I studied at the San Francisco Art Institute, or formerly the California School of Fine Arts, an academic institution, and in a city that figures into White's history, as we've heard. I feel a kind of spiritual student of White's in many ways, but that didn't happen until later. During my time in San Francisco, I was a closeted 20-year-old who worshipped at the altar of new topographics, as so many of us did, I think sort of desperate to bury myself in the bravado of purported objectivity. I hope that's not too shady to say. But by the time I got to grad school at UC Riverside, many years later, I was lost. I felt really frustrated by this approach at photography. I had come out. I stopped making pictures altogether in favor of drawing and sculpture, very bad provisional sculpture. At some point, I picked up a camera again. I was making pictures more from a sense of feeling, from pure intuition, more than anything else, and I had absolutely no language for it. And then at some point I found myself at the Getty for White's Manifestations of the Spirit, which was a Paul Martineau curated survey of White's work that underscored things in his work that nobody in any like undergraduate or community college history of photography class had ever mentioned. For example, his spiritual leanings and also his identity as a gay man. And suddenly I felt like a kind of world had opened up to me. And I found my way to ideas of equivalence and the idea that a person could photograph an internal state of a feeling, a kind of metaphor for their interiority, and that feeling could somehow be transmuted back to a viewer in a picture of something unrelated was just mind-blowing for me. Of course, this is an idea put forth by Stieglitz, but I've always argued that nobody did it better than White or wrote more compellingly about it than him. But back to graduate school. So I think I was wrestling with these ideas of equivalence and my own sort of past life as a student of new topographics, and I arrived at these photographs that I titled Windows, and in them, so here's a group of them, in them you see these construction sites in which contractors have kind of primitively cut into stucco as they attempt to unearth the architecture's original windows that have been buried by years of material. And for me, these latent windows, as much as they look like Balt's photographs, started to represent much more, namely a desire to get beyond the skin of things, which is not so different from White and these ideas around photographic equivalency. I really wanted to move beyond the literal or beyond mere description. An image that was really, really important to me around this time is White's Something Died Here from 1947. Everything about this picture initially suggests that it's primarily about form, a confluence of surfaces that seem to frame what has always looked to me like a kind of undulating marks or blemish at the center of the frame. And yet the title, Something Died Here, would suggest that this picture is about so much more. It complicates this kind of cursory first reading and introduces more questions like what produced these marks and what died here. Is the death a literal or a figurative one? I think White's obliqueness was and still is really exciting to me and underscored the potential for photography. I think it was really important for me because I realized that I simply didn't need to know what the picture suggests, or the title with the picture is that there's a lot more than meets the eye, a world kind of overflowing with possibility and meaning and, most importantly, feeling. In what is now Memorable Fancies, White writes, "In becoming a photographer, I am only changing medium. The essential core of both verse and photography is poetry." While I can think of a great number of photographers for whom this is not accurate at all, I can say that it's really the kind of photography and art, for that matter, that I personally privilege. In later projects, including my first monograph, which is titled Heaven is a Prison, I use poetry as both a literal introduction to the work. Frank Bedart's poem, Hunger for the Absolute, is the first thing you encounter when you open the book. But also the images are broken up into sections, sort of stanzaically. Whoops, I don't know how to go back, but you saw an image. They're organized sort of stanzaically in ways that are not dissimilar from sequences like White's The Temptation of St. Anthony's Mirrors, which also blew the door off my understanding of White when I saw it in that Getty exhibition all those years ago. I could obviously go on a lot about where White's practice has informed my own, but I'll leave it there, and I'm excited to hear what everybody else has to say.
Hi, everyone. How's that? All right, we're better. That's better, right? Oh, that's me. Okay, great. So before I begin, I wanted to acknowledge the passing of photographer Nona Faustine and express my appreciation for her fearless work. I know that is not tonight's topic, but I wanted to take the opportunity to acknowledge her. All right, 2004. First time I saw this picture, I was sitting in the dark in Linda Connor's class at the San Francisco Art Institute. I guess we share that. It could have been in the very classroom that Minor White used to teach in when SFAI was the California School of Fine Arts. Linda's class was called Sacred and Profane, which strikes me as an alternative title for Memorable Fancies. I took her class in the evenings after I moved to San Francisco, unsure about my path, still curious about photography even though I hadn't majored in it as an undergraduate student. I left North Carolina after college and after finally coming out. Often Linda would arrive at class with 4 or 5 fully loaded 80-slide carousels. The night she showed Windowsill Daydreaming, she also showed us the work of Frederick Sommer, Paint on Cellophane. I remember having a tiny revelation, perhaps buoyed by all my new truth-telling, that I might not be very interested in documentary photography. I might be more interested in whatever this was. 2008, graduate school, the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. I was in a Harold Edgerton phase. and I had rigged up a flash that was triggered by audio input. I was sitting in a room at school in the dark, camera on tripod, 3200 speed film, shutter open, listening to Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young's version of Woodstock. Every time the chorus would come on, "We are stardust, we are golden, and we've got to get ourselves back to the garden," I would sing along in the microphone and the flash would go off. I'm wearing a polka dot shirt for maximal synergy with film grain. Once the song ended, I closed the shutter and the exposure ended, 3 minutes and 54 seconds. The more I am exposed, the less visible my photographic image is. The more my shadow is strangely expanded. In reading Memorable Fancies, White's need to use photography to know the self completely is all-consuming. Of course, if in his words that open the book, that he must live a lie his entire life and hide his sexuality, if so much must be hidden, concealed, and masked, then how could the veil itself be elevated to art? One of my advisors in graduate school confided in me that when the faculty committee was curating the MFA thesis show, they weren't sure if I belonged in the mysticism section. He said an argument ensued. This small copy of one of Barbara Genevieve's self-portraits is on the wall in my studio. Of all of my former teachers, I probably think of Barbara the most. Memorable Fancies from March 8, 1947. Steps in the psychological interpretation of photos. As done this term. Sex symbols became seen everywhere. Steam plant, knotholes, stumps, Edward Weston's photographs. Analysis of a dream, Freud. Was Barbara de Genevieve a secret disciple of Minor White? Seems unlikely, but then again, Barbara was full of surprises. A few years ago, after her passing, I was struggling with teaching. I don't remember the exact circumstances, only the familiar longing for Barbara's advice, trying to channel just an ounce of her fight. I had a dream in which she visited my class, producing a big box of glazed donuts to the delight of the room. Rather than pass the box around, she looped all of the donuts on a sword. And then Cackle laughed, and if you knew her, you could imagine this sound. And in a kind of wide-eyed, enchanted terror, each student took a donut from the outstretched sword. White certainly seems to have understood that teaching and learning is an energetic exchange full of pleasure, but not without danger. And that is to say nothing of the power imbalance. I wonder in reading Memorable Fancies how his approach was shaped by his need to be loved. April 2nd, 1950. Abstraction in photography is to reach towards the non-objective without ever breaking the camera's strongest point, the magic of its tether to visual reality. That's one of the reasons I've always loved photograms. They are always relentlessly what they are. A hole punch, the head of a pin, if they point to something else, their quotidian nature is all the more remarkable. In my work, I'm much more attracted to slippage, frailty, error, laid bare, often through iteration. In the darkroom, I think about relying on touch, working from a memorized pattern. I'm getting closer to the essence while moving further from the source. 2015. I curated a show at Higher Pictures called Photography Sees the Surface. The exhibition took as its point of departure a Czech modernist photo manual of the same name from 1935. The instructional volume features photographs by faculty and students highlighting the singular ability of the camera to capture the details of an object's surface. In that spirit, I traced teaching lineages, showing several of my own former professors and students. In researching works for the show, I came back to White's work. Here is the proof card for windowsill daydreaming that was included, and a tantalizing reference to the corresponding entry in Memorable Fancies from July 20th, 1958. It was so wonderful to finally be able to read that now in 2025. A long and fascinating entry about the surrender and delight of making this picture. Here's an excerpt. The negatives only looked interesting. Again, the proof print made my heart jump for joy. The experience of meditation was visible. The picture is not meditation, nor does it have to be deeply contemplated to be understood. It is simply about my entering or looking into another world and returning with something of that world for a little while. What is seen clearly is still behind a pane of very solid glass, pane of glass. And here in the second pane, he spells it P-A-I-N. Here are more works from the show. Here's Sommer's, sorry, I'll go a little slower there. And here's Sommer's paint on cellophane, and Linda Connor's contact print of a glass plate negative of the stars. And here's White's empty head. And then finally, 2 resonant pieces from my former students, Jackie Furtado and Nick George. The surface of things simultaneously evoke and challenge the notion that vision, and perhaps doubly so, depiction, are by their very nature superficial. And I'll end here with Gina Osterloh's "Nothing to see here, there never was," written on a photo backdrop.
I probably encountered minor white for the first time in the mid-'80s through Ellen Dench at the Davidson Art Center at Wesleyan. I believe the first image of his that I saw was nude, barefoot, 1947. It validated me in a way. It felt different, playful, by contrast, less vaulted than the torso of Weston's Neil. It felt anti-ethnographic, yet oblique, embodying erotic play, fragment of torso, figure, angle, framing, lyricism, but clearly not a traditional ethnographic stereotype, rather a suggestive familiarity with photographer and subject. Performative gesture, embodiment of photographer, engaging with language, nude, barefoot, introduce a level of subjectivity and play, not isolated, complicated narrative around desire, queer into subjectivity, a certain level of agency, a naturalism to the image punctuated by the performative gesture. The erotics of the derriere, level of agency activated by the standing figure, no passive portrayal. Specificity of time and location, candid intimacy, queer vernacular scene, journal in the upper left image frame. For me, this pairing is reminiscent of the tradition of modernist photography, sublimated desire, the projection of unrequited desire, coded around sexuality. Mapplethorpe's radicality is that he advanced the conversation by foregrounding the transgressive as exemplified in the exportfolio. That said, it speaks to the radicality of minor white, decades before, in terms of visual representation of queer desire, awaiting discovery by future generations. Golden, Tillmans, Maholi, Sequoia, Opie, to name a few. This pairing strikes an interesting contrast. The portrayal of male nudes under the rubric of physical culture serves to challenge the purity of modernist photography, self-censorship in context of public reception as fine art photography by the Academy, e.g. F64 School. The boots suggest a slippage, contamination through the cracks of modernism. Having considered the work of Minor White and his diaristic writings about homoerotic desire, this early self-portrayal in my creative trajectory, which was produced the same year as my Construct series, it's curious to me how this exploration vis-a-vis White's St. Anthony series, both were not publicly presented until several decades after their execution. Evidence of things not seen, photo laid bare, disrupting, caught in the act of looking, self-pleasuring, embodied in the image, lays bare the apparatus, literary, apropos, Baldwin, as well as the porn, water, Vaseline, journal, camera shutter release, a release after my first year of grad school, reclaiming subjectivity, having been weighed down by academia. Modern White's deep interest and exploration of sequential series was inspiring. Triptych 1 are 3 images distilled from multiple frames shot at NYU Accra, Ghana, faculty house, where I lived for 7 years. In relationship to St. Anthony is coded in reference to physical culture, portraiture, desire, and further inflected by African vernacular photography. It also underscores the problematics around colonial buggery laws and their relationship to contemporary anti-LGBT laws. Inspired by Minor White's journals and his recorded self-affirmations, this journal bears witness to the charge of erotic imagery, self-affirmation, using the erotics of same-sex desire, street vernacular images circulated in the wider culture, pressure to normalize everyday disruptors that take on a certain power, portrayal of homoerotic abandon, power of happening upon this distinct image, expressing self-positive sensibility and a gay vernacular not coded, a resistance, refusal to be co-opted by heteronormativity.
So
Well, thank you, Todd. This is
thank you.
This is a major heavy lift. So I want to just acknowledge that it's opened up. Yeah.
Got a question?
So I think we're going to take a few minutes to discuss among ourselves and then open up to questions. How to start? So, I mean, a few things have come up.
Yeah, a few things came up.
Yes. I mean, one, I think it's probably interesting to consider is, right, the distinction between the sacred and the profane. There's a little bit of a, question mark with that in a sense. I mean, obviously, White prioritized to some extent the sacred, but as Lyle suggests, I mean, there's another way to look at this. That could be, his way of access to material that there was no other way to do it in a way. So, I mean, there is, this mystical, sacred dimension, no doubt, that he is committed to. But one thing I do totally agree with is there is something funny about them, or humorous or ironic, that has not been addressed. In that the mystical framework doesn't quite capture. I mean, I mentioned the Weston and Stieglitz photographs. Those are kind of comic retorts in a sense, but the common dimension between the profane and the mystical, as I see it, is this relational in the sense that he has, or what you call situated or not isolated, multiple elements happening within the picture, versus a modernist tradition, which is about the kind of singularity. So, I mean, the simple way to put it is that one of the things that White says, it's highly controversial, right, is that he sees everything through anthropomorphism, right? He's deeply committed to the idea that you see in an anthropomorphic way. That's my one philosophy, he says. And that is, of course, anathema to Weston. Weston despised the idea that, you'd see bodies in his vegetables. I mean, the whole idea for Weston would be to see a body as vegetable, right, rather than the other way around. Whereas for White, it's all about seeing ourselves in things. I do think that.
Yeah, you have
Oh,
to
sorry.
speak into the microphone.
I'm going to stop in 1 second, but
If you lean it, you have
yes.
to speak into the microphone.
Now I don't remember what I was saying.
Peppers.
But peppers, yes. So see, reversing the poles is for Weston, right? See the human in inanimate objects and the inanimate in the human. That's for Weston, which is a primary commitment to a sense of difference, right, in the particularity of that thing, and not the human. Whereas for White, relationality means that we situate. So it always in the temptation there's something in the photograph alongside. So he's sitting at the table, he has the flower, there's the piece of wood, there's, there's a setting for it, which is, I think, distinctive about what he's doing. This is before, well, he'd taken the photographs before he met Weston, but it's at the same moment in which he meets Weston. So I just want to put that out there again, that the mystical, which there's no doubt is essential to his entire body of work, but there is something kind of mundane that goes with it as well. That I wouldn't want to lose track of, in a sense. I'm just going to put that out there. I don't think anyone's saying otherwise, but it's just a kind of matter of emphasis.
I think I'm interested in the idea that both of them they're sort of saying the same thing. It's two sides of the same coin. I guess, I mean, just to in a white way sort of see myself in something else. Like, I think about my relationship to similar subjects, and I think more about reciprocity. I did, in reading the material, I was sort of fascinated to arrive at this moment where Weston seems very irritated. You write about this in the introductory essay. He seems like a little bit defensive. But I wanted to get back to this idea of abjection that maybe, it sounds like maybe you don't feel in White's work, but there's so much in the ideology behind the making of the work. It's so much about a kind of abdication of the self. And that is a kind of abjection that is really fascinating to me. It feels like there's a lot of self-loathing kind of embedded in his approach that I wasn't aware of until I read this. And I guess I'm very interested in Simone Weil and her writing around ideas like decreation, and that is all about abjection towards God.
Yes.
And it seems like White sort of felt similarly, but was using, rather than prose, photography as a way of abdicating, to be nothing.
Yeah, I'm going to jump in that too. Gonna wade into those waters. When I showed the Woodstock piece, that I made in school, I thought a lot about, I guess, the burden of needing to be so visible in order to have your humanity fully accepted and seen as a queer person, and that was a desire to disappear. That in some ways that piece also references that. And I thought the same thing going through Memorable Fancies, this wanting to understand the self almost like as clearly as you could possibly understand it, and then the moments that he's talking about wanting the self to completely disappear, it just felt like it went back and forth between that so much. But it's interesting yeah.
I don't know. I feel like that speaks to the complexity of his life. I don't necessarily
Yeah.
I don't necessarily see it as abject. I think in a way, I find it fascinating the fact that he would be able to create St. Anthony in 48 and it not to be released, let's say, when did it first become public, let's say?
Well, the Getty show was when people saw
and
it.
what year was that again?
What was that?
I saw that show too. That's so funny that you brought that up. That really blew my mind. That was 2014
Brendan?
or 15?
14.
14. Okay.
2014.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because one also has to speak the idea of traces, the fact that if one, this is different than, let's say, Foucault finding out after his relationship to the bat, let's say, after his death, in terms of his relationship to, let's say, desire. And this is different for me in that White actually left traces,
Right.
projected a narrative into the future. And I think it's also important I didn't see Klaus's show on Warhol in Berlin. From my understanding, for those who saw that show, there was a timeline that gave of queer history. So you situate the work historically. What was White? What was he situated against? I even think about Pasolini, for example. Let's say the trilogy of, let's say, Arabian Nights, Decameron, and Canterbury Tales. The fact that it is abject, it's also profane, but it's also an element of the sacred through working through a certain hypocrisy around what we mean by the sacred. So I would actually argue the fact that maybe it's through the working through that it moves beyond a certain heteronormativity and to a certain form of the sacred through his lens, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, I love what you just said about an understanding of projecting into the future. I mean, I think, the memorable Fancies starts off with his story that his family read his diary as a teenager and discovered that he was queer, or that he had homo leanings. I think that was the term White used. And that the book sort of starts off with this violation, that he didn't want that to be disclosed.
Familial violation.
Yes, exactly.
I think we should name it.
Yes,
again.
thank you. Yeah. And then you read on, and then he acknowledges immediately after that memorable Fancies was always meant to be read. So I love that tension in starting and thinking about, you're right, he left all these traces.
Yeah, I mean, it's worth mentioning that he had a kind of core set of modernist commitments to impersonality, right? From the beginning, he was a deep admirer of William Blake and T.S. Eliot, right? He photographs family reunion, very early on. He quotes Eliot all the time, and he's kind of obsessed from the beginning with impersonality, which is a kind of core modernist commitment. And for me, there's no way to kind of reconstruct what his project is about without a sense of his belief in communication, like universal communication. I think universal communication just turns into communion, right, by the end. With the universe, but he writes incessantly about an Aperture, right? For the first 10 years of Aperture, the whole project of reading is about the capacity to communicate deeply with an audience through a photograph. So a lot of it is about how people read photographs, right? So it's almost like surveying how people respond, and then taking that material, how people respond, and he wants people to really go for it. Like their responses go as far as they can into their own, self as to how they respond. And then he would take that information back in and feed it into the next photograph so he could control it, right? And he's very clear about this. He wants to communicate on a deep level universally. So, and again, it's a kind of, he says with the Eliot, he's like, my single emotion is frustration, right? It's a dark moment in the book, right? It's like he looks back on his life and he kind of says, frustration is my basic emotion. But then he quotes, the Eliot, now I don't remember the phrase about frustration, but that, he is frustrated, but so is everyone, right? We're all frustrated. And that's meaningful, I think, for him, that he would be understood. That goes along with the notion of sublimation. He was very clear that he thought that what he was doing is sublimation. Now, that's not a very fashionable idea, to imagine that what you do through working in a medium is to improve yourself through communication, to socialize and sublimate. It's Freud. He studied with Meyer Shapiro, who's doing kind of psychoanalytic art history, and he thought sublimation really would be, is what we do, is what humans do. He's not wrong. But I do that these are abrasive concepts in a certain sense, that I would want to hold on to that ideas of universal communication, of things like sublimation, of moving from self to other, you're not wrong about the Vi. I think that's right. So in any case, I just want to put those out there. There's a kind of modernist dimension here that's, it doesn't look like a lot of modernism, but it's a lot of kind of modernist ideas.
It's already been said, but it seems to me like he's just deeply conflicted, because there's another moment. Our artist has one thing to say himself that is like at odds with everything that was just said around his like interest in more pure description. That's not a judgment. I sort of love that and relate to these kinds of conflicts, because I think they're productive of so much in the work. I think that was really a big takeaway for me, is that he was just a deeply conflicted person who contradicted himself constantly. And that was actually really, as an artist, that was really valuable to read. I am sort of fascinated by, I don't know it, I'm curious to know what other people think about this. It seems to me, like I think about Weston's daybooks and also this, that there's a kind of impulse at this period to kind of write a manifesto and get it right. And that doesn't feel, it doesn't feel productive. It sort of forecloses a lot of things for an artist, but yeah, it just seems like a weight. It just seems like a very big trend at the time somehow. Sommer did it too, actually. Wrote a lot about what a photograph should be or could do, and it was fascinating to read so much about that in here. Not Sommer, but these kind of, he's dictating the terms of what photography should be constantly, even if they're at odds.
Yeah. I mean, to himself as well.
Yeah.
I agree. All I would say about that is I might distinguish between conflicted, which he very much was, and contradictory, which I don't see as much. I think he's quite consistent in his conflicted state, that he's working through this very primary conflicts in himself throughout his life, and he's struggling. I mean, it is no doubt a book filled with a kind of personal struggle that he wants to, move beyond. Yeah.
I found that deeply inspiring. I think this is a major volume to acknowledge of how an artist struggle to be such a foundational figure, and the birth of Aperture to have again left traces. And this is a major volume. So congratulations to you and to Princeton. I think it's important that there is this record. For the next generation. I think that's deeply inspiring. Mike, I just want to read a passage where he's Edmund Tesk, and it's Tesk, right? Yeah. So his critique of that photograph was there was an element of violence, and I think in a way it's also protective violence, because the way how that image might have been received by the public, if you will. It's if you're not familiar with the image, it's an image of Edmund Tesk, and it's a nude, and it's quite erotic, and it's a figure, a image of a horizontal figure, and there seems to be a wrench, and there seems to be some sort of coil or something around a erect phallus or penis, correct?
Yep.
For lack of a better description. So
that
just gives you a bit of background. So. White, let me just say, writing 1962 to Edmund Tesk, then a struggling gay photographer, White admonishes him about the distinction he made in his first essay about the difference between expressive and creative photography. Quote, "Your photographs are still mirrors of yourself. In other words, your images are raw, the motions naked. These are private images, not public ones. They are expressive, meaning a direct mirror of yourself rather than creative." Still recalling this earlier moment, White recommends that the photographer read Boleslavsky's acting, in which the author described the clothing of the naked emotions that is necessary to art. White was referring to the fourth lesson on characterization, in which the teacher observed the students' display of naked emotions on the stage. This emotional display was pathological. Boleslavsky wrote, quote, "For the audience, such a complete sincerity is embarrassing, as if something suddenly makes naked in the midst of a dressed-up crowd." So, and I think your point was that
I didn't say pathological.
No. I'm saying that quote. But the point being is that was this prior to this? This is in '62. So this is actually. Talk a little bit about your point in relationship to the temptation, because it seemed you were making an interesting point.
Yeah. So Peter talks about this photograph and this discussion with Tesk, and I'm sure he talked to White about this photographer, and it's a tense moment. There is no question. And White is chastising his earlier self, right, in Edmontesque with these photographs. And it is kind of abrasive chastising, right? But what's so striking is that he goes back to the absolutely earliest terms from the 30s about the difference between expressive and creative photography, right? And yes, I was very much drawn to the idea that here he is in 62 talking about mirrors, a direct mirror of yourself, right? The temptation of St. Anthony is mirrors, right? So the mirror is yourself, to looking at yourself as narcissism, right? And the whole point is to get out of that narcissistic stage towards a more public social being, no matter who you are. And that photography as a mechanism has this first degree detachment, just by virtue of its what we used to call indexical nature, separating you from yourself. And that for him was like essential. So it's a path of progressive decreation, if you like, through the medium as a first layer of detachment. So you're automatically, with your first photographs, always already past the expressive and on the way to creation. But to creation would be some kind of communal, ultimately, some kind of communal communication. So he's trying to press this photographer to move beyond himself and his world. How do we take this now? I don't know. It is his commitment, and I wouldn't want to say that sublimation is just repression. That's what I would want to say. He's too serious. He's too smart. He's too sophisticated. He's heard all the arguments, right? And he still thinks on some level this is what people need to pass through, is a stage of a distantiation, which photographs can help you do. And I really believe that he thought progressively we can kind of de-self through photography.
I think it would be helpful for the audience, thank you for that, to give a context what was happening socially and historically in 48. I mean, so it's 10 years before McGarthy era. It would be helpful just to situate that, for an audience, as an historian, what was happening.
Yeah, I mean, he's young. I mean, he's quite, how old is he now? He's in late 30s.
Like with the dissemination of nude images of men, was that illegal? I'm just wondering, what is the context? Just sort of paint a picture for what are we talking about?
They're not disseminated, as you rightly put. He was as exposed as anyone could be in his lifetime, meaning he was as openly gay, I think, as anyone could be in his lifetime.
And in the letters, let's say with Weston, how was that? I want to paint us a picture, the context, because there's one thing to be invited at the party. I'm just wondering. And because if you think about, let's say, Weston's relationship with Tina Madeti, I'm just thinking about that, how that's almost the lauded in terms of his sexual prowess, for example. Yeah. So how was Minor White?
It's impossible.
So I just want to get a context to situate us so we understand.
Yeah.
At that moment, being the disciple, let's say, of Weston.
It's as complicated as you've just suggested. There is no way that Weston or Stieglitz would have anything to do with this. I mean, Weston was deeply misogynistic, among other things, and kind of masculine to the core in a certain way. I mean, listen, Weston is an incredible photographer, but not a great guy. This is how I put it. I think that he is creating for himself a dialogue with these photographers. That's what I'm calling the relational. So that Pepper is going to be talking to something else. And he thinks that is, what Weston is actually doing, even if Weston can't recognize that. So Weston is also a kind of relational photographer. He just wouldn't acknowledge it. So the relationality or sociality or publicness that he keeps talking about is simply putting things in dialogue. Not, as you said, not isolating. So White, never isolates his elements, and that for him, it doesn't matter if it's like doors and rocks and kelp or whatever, or bodies. They're always in some kind of communication, and for him, it's kind of a universal communication, which Stieglitz is more about the heroic individual. Weston is about the kind of inhuman, and White is about a kind of communication between things. So. it is private. I don't think there was no way for him to kind of say this. But, you know, I mean, even something like Aperture, which is a deeply historical journal and magazine, would have nothing to do with, you know, Weston and Stieglitz's sensibility in a certain sense. I mean, I mentioned and I showed it, like he's got a Van Gogh and he's got a Picasso in the photograph. You have to understand that for Stieglitz and Weston, it is an organicism of the nth degree, right? Culture is not there. I mean, that's a little overstated, but you know, it's always
within the image itself.
Yes.
I mean, of course. I mean, Stieglitz. I mean, he did. And they did not. Was that not the first place where African sculpture was shown in the U.S.? I mean, in the gallery?
Yeah. In 1930,
I mean, I'm just wanting.
Yeah. But he still saw it in very particular kinds of terms about the isolated object. Yeah. I mean, I think he's trying to bring, you know, this dialogue or relationality or situatedness of the figure. I mean, even the one that we started here at the beginning, where he's standing it's a man standing in a setting, right? Whereas for Weston, it's always going to be this kind of sublime, you know, confrontation, either extreme close-up or wide angle, right? And not much in between. Whereas White kind of likes the in-between. He'll do close-ups for sure, but he likes this and that. I think over time he was able to give access to these kinds of a new way of. I think he saw as a new way of seeing. Small footnote: the Aperture point, right? I think White is also the first photographer who has a history of photography behind what he's doing, right? I don't think that Stieglitz or Weston thought in those terms. I don't think they thought about the history of photography and where they situated themselves in it. Or White was concerned. I mean, so the Aperture has this kind of art history dimension to it. You can see the history of photography, and they're very, you know, you go through it, and it goes through the 1890s and the, you know, P.H. Emerson and all these kind of earlier photographers are there.
Can you hold the microphone?
Yeah.
Like every third word breaks up.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry. So it's kind of further on the relational point
think it comes
is that
off
there's a historical dimension to White's project that Aperture exemplifies.
Thank you.
Should we turn?
I would love to hear from
Yeah.
Jim, since Jim was inspiring. We'd love to get
He doesn't remember that.
Get his blessing on. You want a mic?
I'm just saying when Jim said that, I would have never imagined anyone from that generation had the slightest interest in something like Minor White, but I was totally wrong.
What?
Well, I'm not sure if it's the same.
I first heard Minor White's voice on the back cover of Aperture. There would be a Polaroid ad, and they'd reproduce a Polaroid, usually black and white, and Minor White would write, "The camera was used faithfully." This was his thing. It's about, so, you know, my introduction to Minor White was, you know, technical books, and I really, when I was in my 20s, just was not interested in his work. I was compared to it. That was an insult, the abstract photographs. So it took me a while to come around to more Minor. But at a certain point in California, I really looked at a lot of White pictures, and of course the pictures I like are the ones with the black sun, where he's got the solarized sun, or his very late photographs, which I still want to see, of construction sites, which were used in how to make photographs by the zone system manual. You know, I was obsessed with the zone system, but I never could master it, and I really think it's not for me. I don't know. So a lot of random thoughts about Minor White. I can't wait to read the book.
Thank you.
Can I? Well, in 1969, when I came to graduate school, Aaron Siskin brought out two books, Harry Callahan's El Machuelo, and Mirror's Messages and Manifestations. And he said, this is about all you really need to And he sold them to us, actually. And by the way, Mirror's Messages and Manifestation is a beautifully produced book. There's a reprint of it. It's horrible, but Aperture did it, I guess. It was the state of the art. And it inspired a whole generation of people my age. I'm older than you, older than many here. And what I think hasn't been touched upon is miners looking at light, understanding that light was the message of photography, that light defined space, relationality, the subject, the surface, the aura of the photograph as an object. Not to mention the quality of the print itself. His zone system, his critique discussions, Light to the Seven, an Aperture thing which I show to students all the time. And the writings in Aperture, which is where I encourage we didn't have this, were part of what we understood that the spirituality of photography, forget, you know, identity, gender, all the other things that were there. It was, this could be a beautiful thing because of the way it depicted the surface of a rear end, if nothing else. And it was terribly influential to my generation of photographers. And that, you know, it sort of lapsed that history, as somebody mentioned, you know, the topographics and other things happened. But believe me, it was well known and well appreciated.
This is a non-question, or this is just like a random thing, but hearing that made me think about how uncool I was in graduate school for talking about all of these things. I was like from another planet. They just thought I was so corny.
We all were.
My question is, after, since I had purchased the 1968 version of the White and White book when I was a student myself, excuse me, and looking at the nudes that were shown today, I see an influence of George Platt's lines in regards to a lot of the poses and the kind of lighting. And I'd be curious to find out if any of you know whether there was that kind of an influence.
Curious. A relationship.
Sorry, say
George Platt lines.
Oh.
Did they know mono white? I mean, what were they?
Not that I know of.
So even though a lot of the poses
Could be.
and the way it was lit seemed to be, you know, kind of influence, as far as you know, there wasn't any influence.
Not that I recall, but
It speaks to how positive it is.
yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
No.
I'm gonna jump in with there was I didn't quote from it in when I prepared, but I'm paraphrasing from a section where he's writing about, I think he said, the pursuit of technical perfection is like sharpening a knife that you never get to cut with. I don't know. I'm just interjecting that back out as we think about, you know, the obsession with like the perfect print and all those things that were of course so influential. When I came across that quote, I really loved it, and I wondered if I was interpreting it the right way, or to think of purity as some kind of arms race, you know, that you just go after it forever and you never it never comes to anything. So that's what jumped to my mind.
It's probably a dig at Adams.
Yeah.
To the question of George Platt lines, I think they were both looking at art history as much as White is really invested in photography and seems to like resent the pictorialists for being interested in painting. It seems that he was looking at like Renaissance painting as was lines, and I think borrowing poses pretty liberally from those paintings.
Yeah. Yeah.
I I indirectly am a disciple of Minor White because so many photography teachers studied with him, and then they branched out all across the country. And the post-war generation, for many of us, God had died, but we were looking for something, and we weren't actually photographers, but we were studying photography because of the spirituality. We were introduced to Gurdjieff and things that our suburban middle-class families never introduced us to.
Right.
So it was very poignant. The two things that I learned indirectly from Minor White was to read a photograph. In other words, to spend time. I mean, we were supposed to curl up and spend maybe an hour looking at one picture, which is the foundation for many of our careers. We take it very seriously. But the other thing was sequence. And my teacher had a lot of Minor White photographs. It was incredibly important, the sequencing. And if you could speak a little bit about, you spoke about the relationships within the picture, but not too much about, and I'd also like to know how sequencing might have impacted all your careers.
Who wants to jump on
Please.
this? You want to take it first?
Well, I think I sort of already mentioned the way that I use sequencing that is very influenced by White, and also a photographer, Paul Graham, A Shimmer of Possibility, the way that he sequenced that book. Those two things really informed the way I edited my first monograph. But when you were mentioning reading a photograph, I got excited because I know that about White, but I think something that I often see in monographs and exhibitions, which is that, and this, I also love, on many occasions, I love exhibitions that are hung this way, so this isn't a dig either, but sometimes it can look like a garage sale, and I really resent that because I have an affinity for the image and spending time with the image, and I think that sometimes gets lost today. Just a random
Wait, what
thought.
looks like a garage sale?
Exhibitions of photography. There's just like 2,000 photographs on a wall that it seems sort of like an apology for not having made good images. But also, I love if the work is good, it's good. It's just, I'm a spiritual student of White's and really like the image.
Yeah, which is probably a perfect counterpoint for me to jump in and say that I don't really work in sequences, and I tend to work in iteration, and which is sort of the it's like the anti-choosing a perfect image, but I'm more interested in kind of repetition into failure, or trying to find another way to think about how the medium works, maybe materially. I don't work as much in sequence, but I agree with you. I think actually some of the best parts of Memorable Fancies are his discussions about sequencing and the depth of thinking through what belongs together. And I loved reading those passages, and I think that's a real interesting strength of White's, was to pair things together that didn't obviously seem like they would go together. And that's some of the best part of the book, I think.
And I totally agree that I think some of the most fascinating parts of the whole book are how he puts the sequences together. Which is in a certain sense an allegory for the making of the Memorable Fancies, right? There's a kind of constant backtracking and rewriting and recomposing and putting into new combinations. That I think that's one of his biggest contributions, and obviously very different from other photographers. But yes, I do see the relationality within the photographs. The sequencing is a version of that same point.
Yeah, I don't know what to say. Yeah, I don't know what to say really about that. I guess I'll say one thing. What I really enjoy and getting a pleasure from this book, and given my, I went to Wesleyan for undergraduate. I studied with Ellen Dench, but after that I went to CalArts and I studied with the great Alan Sekula. So it was a radically different orientation from the West Coast school. And I don't think I would be here today without having that orientation, because I think at that time when I was applying to grad school, and I did apply to Yale, I think it would be a very different trajectory for my career without having the type of critical anti-formalist of, let's say, the West Coast, but specifically CalArts under Catherine Lord and Alice Aquila. That said, I was fortunate enough to meet Davola, John Davola, who for one semester, and he said, don't just become another grad student speaking theory. So for me, it was important to have both, so there is, in reading this book and spending time, everything white for the last, month, all the Aperture articles, etc. Thank you so much, Alex, for that. There's been something being reawakening around the possibility. So particularly, on this person, we're just turning 16, thinking he died at 68, and just thinking about imagining this chapter, if that makes any sense. So it's instructive for me, but there are certain questions that I have in terms of, let's say, longevity around his life, in terms of I think I'm curious about, be curious to see, and maybe the archive has that, the deeper dive. Even I'm thinking about, let's say, Mapplethorpe's, let's say, The Black Book, in looking at this book, is there a glossary of the subjects, the people in the photographs? And that, for me, remains to be talked about. Speaking of relational, who are they? Let's say, if you think about Robert Mapplethorpe's Black Book, 40 years after the book is done, if it is 40 years, what is an inventory of who's alive and who's not, and who are they exactly? Similarly, with White, I think that's the next book to come out, if we can actually begin to create a biography of those people, because that's a way to tap in to another level of the relational.
If you want,
can we also look at, let's say I finished reading this book with Frida Kahlo and her relationship, Diego, in terms of, I'm not going to get into that, but my point being is that just thinking about the certain moments in the book, I'll take that back. There is an implicit judgment, let's say, on sexual difference from an historical standpoint. I think we have to look at, relationally, what was allowed and what wasn't. And how do we account for the breadth of the influence and create different types of language, or spheres of intimacy, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, actually, it's sort of a question about what you just said, but also going back to what you all were talking about. And you all read the book, and we haven't yet.
Well, it's available.
Yeah, no, Princeton is sending me one, so I count on that being true. I was struck by the Eliot, and that he loved Eliot, which I hadn't known. So Eliot, in personality, a certain version of modernism, and Eliot also kind of famously said, the commitment to impersonality goes with someone to not having poetry that doesn't express your deepest feelings, that doesn't express your emotions, is really available to and useful for someone who actually has very strong feelings and very strong emotions. Said, unless you have those, you don't know what it means to want to be able to escape them. Okay? So his personality is not like, he's like, it's kind of acknowledgement, committed to impersonality, a certain version of what the person would be. So like Eliot, so I'm a literary critic. Eliot was huge when I was first in graduate school, but in the last 15 or 20 years has become a much more marginal figure until a few years ago, when people discovered a trove of letters that they'd never seen before, which revealed his deep passion and then super bad behavior in relation to a young and then progressively less young woman whom he led on for years and then disappointed. And now people are super interested in Eliot again. They're interested in putting back the personality that Eliot understood himself to be working hard to keep out of poetry. Right? There's a certain way in which the interest in Eliot is now a reclamation of biography, which is certainly relevant. If you were Eliot could say, now we know what you were repressing. Whereas before, we just had to take your word for it. You know, these strong feelings. Now we know they are. But there's a sense in which our view, the current view of Eliot, is a view of someone whose poetry is now reread. It's now, in fact, reread as a kind of expression of the feelings that he understood himself as getting rid of. So when you guys are talking about the light, it really seems like this is a complete, and even in some of your own responses, all of which were super fascinating. It was really great to hear this. But it seems that this is a complete version of that that's just asking for it, which is that now we've found, White's own account of these things, which not only was he repressing, but which he had to repress.
Yeah.
And the whole socio-historical thing is that he couldn't possibly have not repressed them. I mean, the only model we have for someone who didn't somehow repress them and survive would be someone like Bayard Rustin, who's kind of contemporary. But he had to repress them. But there's a way in which I wonder if there's a sense of something, this goes back to the community, that doesn't get lost a little bit when you think that now the truth is in what was repressed, as opposed to the truth being in the effort of repression. So I just wonder how y'all feel about that.
I did just remember the Eliot phrase that he quotes, right? After he says that he's, his basic emotion is frustration, then he says, why don't make, and this is the Eliot, a banquet of frustration, right? The banquet is the photographs, right? It results in something.
Yeah, that was thank you. That was really well said and a really provocative way to think about this. I mean, I read that too, the part about frustration, and the temptation to me is just to think, well, how that this must have distorted you so much to live a life this way through this frustration, that I'm reading this thinking about what did that distort about your worldview and what you thought was possible, and how much you needed photography to kind of, I guess that's exactly what your point is. It's like, how do you kind of take those things on balance? And I appreciated when you said earlier, Todd, that you can't just read this whole thing as like there's a difference between sublimation and repression, that his project was sublimation, and you can't completely just read it all as like, oh God, of course, I read it so much too, and thinking about my own story of coming out and just thinking, of course, like, oh God, of course this explains everything. And it's not that simple. Or I don't think he would have wanted it to seem that simple either. That's my take. Yeah.
I mean, I'll just say one thing is that, the slight difference between Eliot and White on this is that these are photographs of naked men, right? So we don't need the archive to be opened up. It's always been there. And that's amazing, right? Even though he was, had these social cultural issues he had to accept, he still pressed on with as explicit as you could be in that period. The personality and impersonality are there together.
I'm like in dork mode trying to find something that I wrote at some point, but I'm not finding it. I'll just I'll concur. That was I loved what you said, and it brought me back also to sublimation and how there is sublimation and repression are incredibly different, and sublimation is actually productive of something, and this is just like pure speculation on my part, but there is a part of me in reading this that felt like the sublimation was something he wanted more than the intimacy that was absent and frustrated him. And I also know that's like a very human experience, like the photography was more essential to him than intimacy. And just thinking about actively courting sublimation in order to make work, because that is of primary importance. Is
the way you just put it is really great.
Yeah.
Someone said about Eliot.
Yeah.
Someone said about Eliot that poetry was more important to him than intimacy, and that's why that woman got herself sacrificed.
Yeah.
That'd be exactly right.
I think we've been told to wrap up.
Did Marvin want to say closing couple words?
Oh, yeah.
Marvin, please.
Yeah.
I'm sitting here thinking about a lot of things. And I remember in the 1970s not being interested in minor white because it seemed too kind of woo-woo, out there, meditative, in a way that didn't communicate at that point in the culture. So I'm interested in Lyle saying, you got to look at this in terms of the culture of the period. And the other thing I'm thinking about is Charlie's comment about light. And I'm thinking about these people in this period of time making these pictures in dark rooms. Right? They're making these pictures in the dark. They're in a mystical place. And you talk about sublimation, they're trying to, get whatever they could out of these negatives. And that's kind of an interesting thing, so it's hard, for me, it was hard at the time to look at the pictures. And now I'm thinking it's interesting. They're interesting to look at because of that emphasis. Gail was saying about looking at pictures for a really long time. Nobody was. It was a very small community of people who were talking to each other, who valued this stuff. So that's kind of fascinating, to think about. And how can how can we read back into that period of time and how deep that experience was of making those kind of pictures and seeing something and making connections between spirituality and pieces of paper and chemistry in a dark room, right? And then, making abstract pictures and then, making pictures of naked guys. So it's interesting to try to put yourself back into this period and think what was going on. You think about people like Teskey, who was making way crazier pictures than minor white was. And so the gay thing in that period is also a really interesting thing that would be, there's Jared French, there's Cadmus, there's all kinds of stuff going on in that period. And so how to reconcile the sexuality stuff with the spirituality stuff is interesting. Yeah, so I'm really curious to read the book.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Well, thanks, Todd.
Thank you all. Thank you.